of where we are. It's February 2023. We are 1 year into this war. What is the state of play right now?
Yeah, I think this war has not gone the way that just about everyone thought. At one point, everyone was concerned that the Russians were going to overrun the capital and oust the Ukrainian government. And then after this fall, there was a lot of jubilation as the Ukrainians ejected the Russians from northern Ukraine as well as in the Kherson region in the south. But things seem to have stabilized now. Russia has called up a mobilization of forces. There's estimated I saw around 320,000 Russian troops inside Ukraine now, and another about 100 to 150,000 in reserve. So this is more than twice of the forces that the Russians began this war with. So we're sort of at a stalemate at this point, which was expected because of the winter months. But the Russians do appear to be planning for an offensive, but it's hard to tell where they're actually doing this. Right now, most of the fighting, most of the reporting of the fighting is in the Donbas region in the east. The Russians have been massing forces there, and they are taking some ground. It's slow. It's a slog, but if they can take the city of Bakhmut, it's a key city along the crossroads of two major highways. It's a key transportation, a logistical hub for the Russians. But whether they could capitalize on those gains, it's really difficult to tell. I see things far across the spectrum in the analysis of this. And given the way this war has gone, it's anyone's guess what the next phase is. But I do think we're going to see increased fighting in the south, in the east, in the Donbas region. And this is going to foil the Ukrainians' plans to try to eject Russia from the Crimea. The Ukrainians want the Russians completely out of Ukraine. And I don't think that's possible, given the commitment that the Russians are now making to this. And one other thing I'd like to mention here, too, is the sanctions. These were heralded at the beginning as going to break the back of the Russians within weeks, if not months. And I think what we've seen here in this war is that the Russians have really gotten around this. Their GDP, I believe, is down somewhere only around 3% this year. It hasn't broken the back of their military and industrial complex. It hasn't caused the Russians to end this war and withdraw from Ukraine. So we have to really think hard about the efficacy of economic sanctions and the soft power, so to speak.
Where do the Russians, from a pure order of battlefield assessment of these opposing forces standpoint, right, or order of battle, where do the Russians have the advantage, and where are the Ukrainians able to exploit Russian weaknesses?
Yeah, the Russians have the qualitative advantage, meaning they have the numbers. Russia is 3 to 4 times larger than Ukraine, so they have far more recruits to gather, or they can conscript and recruit from far more of the population than Ukraine can. They have the legacy Soviet military hardware and munitions that they can draw on, and they manufacture. So these are the big advantages of the Russians. The Ukrainians have their advantages. They're fighting for their homeland, right? They're fighting on their own soil, so they're far more motivated. But also the support they are receiving from the West, and that has made a difference. And they are getting more advanced weaponry. But I think my concern with the Ukrainians' advantage at some point is, when does certain Western countries tire of spending billions or tens of billions or even hundreds of billions of dollars in supporting what is looking to be another long, and what a lot of people, when they describe the war on terror, becoming an endless war. This is a narrative that was put out on both the far right and the far left, and in between during the war on terror, and it led to the withdrawal from Afghanistan. It exhausted the American public. I don't think we're there. I don't think we're close to that point. But if Russia can keep it a stalemate or make slow advances, this is where, and the West tires, and it's not able to send the munitions, because we're not manufacturing nearly enough to replace what we've given the Ukrainians, as well as to arm them on a regular basis, because they're expending particularly munitions like artillery and air defense missiles at a staggering rate in order to hold off the Russians. So that also, I think, time. That's another advantage that the Russians have. Ukrainians, they're more willing, they're more adaptable. I think they're more motivated, and they have been integrating Western weapon systems. But there are problems with that since they're getting a hodgepodge of weapon systems. They're not using a single system, so they'll get American tanks and German tanks and Ukrainian, or I'm sorry, British tanks, and those all have their own maintenance and logistical issues to deal with. Whereas the Russians have the old Soviet hardware and the new hardware they're manufacturing, it's all homemade. The Ukrainians are expending that old Soviet hardware, and they're not able to replace that. So those are the sort of the plus and minuses for each side.
What do you view as the realistic risk of this escalating into a nuclear fight?
I was far more concerned about this earlier in the war, given the rhetoric that was being put out on, particularly on both sides. I'm less concerned about this now, but I am still concerned. With a regime like the Putin regime.
Could I actually rephrase the question really quickly, Bill?
Yeah, absolutely.
What in your mind would you say you are confident Russia would respond to nukes? What would make Russia go nuclear?
That's an excellent question. I think direct Western involvement, if NATO directly got involved, that would be one situation where the Russians may consider using nuclear weapons. And another is if they're actually, if the Ukrainians hit them hard enough that the Russian military is in danger of losing significant ground or losing significant forces, that might be another case where the Russians might use a nuclear weapon. So those would very likely in those cases be tactical battlefield nukes that would be used. But once once that happens, all bets are off. This isn't, nobody wants to play the game of chicken with nuclear weapons.
Is Putin in a weaker or stronger position 1 year into this war than when it was started?
I would say he is in a stronger position today. And it may not be, look, the Russians have had problems on the battlefield, but they still have made significant gains in Ukraine. He still has the support of the Russian elite, of the Russian military and intelligence establishment. You're not seeing major protests inside of Russia. You're not seeing an economic collapse. He's able to raise forces he's calling up the reserves. That's not a problem. He's standing his ground just as well as Zelensky is standing his ground. I would say, it's hard to believe, but both of them are actually stronger than the day that this war started. It's hard to say that with Zelensky since, there is still a significant portion of Russian ground or Ukrainian ground under Russian control. But he's in a very strong position. He's getting his weapons from the West. He's getting a lot of his demands met. And the same thing with Putin. He's getting what he needs to wage his war inside of Ukraine with very little domestic resistance. And internationally, I don't think Putin is as isolated as Western leaders like to say. I mean, yes, with the West, but that was to be expected. But when it comes to the countries that matter to Russia, like India, like China, and other countries, and really the global South, Putin is not a pariah to these countries.
How do you think the Biden administration has handled this so far? In the most nonpartisan viewpoint possible, what have they done right? What have they done wrong?
I would say at the outset of the war, the administration was didn't have a coherent message. And I think its messaging on Ukraine and its commitment to Ukraine has improved drastically since the beginning of this war. For instance, the Biden administration was able to convince Germany to send those Leopard 2 tanks and is going to send M1 Abrams tanks to the Ukrainians. These are needed if the Ukrainians are going to mount an offensive potentially, or at the very least to conduct a defensive. But yeah, so in the beginning it was, he was all over the place, President Biden, in his messaging. It was very incoherent. I think he has organized the coalition of Western nations that are supporting Ukraine fairly well. This isn't perfect. And again, and here's another imperfect aspect of this. It seemed like President Biden had to be dragged kicking and screaming for him to supply American tanks. The Germans weren't going to provide tanks to the Ukrainians because they didn't want the Russians to potentially use that against them, to use it as a flashpoint to escalate against the Germans. So the Germans' position was, well, if the Americans send tanks too, then it's not just the Germans doing it; it's all of NATO doing it. So it gets them under the protection of the NATO umbrella. I don't know how we could debate the wisdom of that argument, but it took President Biden a while to make that decision. But ultimately, he has made decisions that have benefited Ukraine. Another aspect of this, though, that I don't like that this administration is doing. I do believe there should be accountability for the weapons and aid that is flowing into Ukraine. If you even question the idea that maybe this isn't being done efficiently, or perhaps there might be some corruption inside Ukraine that makes you pro-Putin and pro-Russian, but we've the American public has a right, when hundreds of billions of dollars, over $100 billion now, and I guarantee you it's going to be hundreds of $billions, and several years it'll be approaching $1 trillion. The American public has a right to know where this money is going and how efficiently it's being used. And this administration is not willing to do that. Its messaging on that issue is just, if you want that, then you must support Russia. You must support.
Yeah, I mean, to that end, you often will hear on the right very pointed criticism of Ukraine as, before the invasion, a deeply corrupt place. How fair is that assessment, and how important is that to understanding the politics of that country?
It's a very fair assessment. I mean, if you read the newspaper prior to the read the New York Times, read the Washington Post, or any other major newspaper, they're filled with stories of corruption, Ukrainian corruption, its political system, but not just that, but like its integration of right-wing militias, basically, such as the Azov Brigade, which has been made an official unit in the military, in the Ukrainian military. This is a neo-Nazi organization. I mean, but this has all been whitewashed since the Russian invasion, because any criticism whatsoever of the Ukrainians, look, we can be concerned about issues of corruption and accountability, and be concerned about human rights and things like right-wing militias inside of Ukraine, and still support Ukraine in its fight against Russia. This idea that you have to be 100% on board or you're on the other side, this is just a strange polarization of politics that we witnessed over the last 10 years that is deeply disturbing to me.
What would have to happen for Russia to stop? What that people often ask, where is the diplomacy in all of this? We're not even really hearing about any negotiations certainly happening at the high level here to bring this conflict to a close. Maybe something's happening behind closed doors we're not aware of. But what is an acceptable end to the fighting from the Russian perspective? I mean, from the Ukrainian perspective, I assume it's get the hell out of our country.
Right. And that's the problem here. You won't have meaningful negotiations when both sides, and on the Ukrainian side, rightfully so, maximalist goals, right? The Ukrainian goal is get every Russian out of every inch of our country. Completely understandable. The Russians' position, they just annexed 4 territories within Ukraine, and they're going to continue to fight for them. When that's the position of each side, there is no room for diplomacy. There's no room for talks. I think the only way this actually ends is on the battlefield. One side has to gain an advantage over the other. And I don't see that happening. And that's why I think we're going to be in a situation where this is going to be a lengthy war.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you next. I hear people saying this could go on 3 years, 5 years, who knows? Do both sides, assuming the NATO and U.S. support continues to the Ukrainians at a similar level to what it has been, do you think that both sides could drag on a war for 5 years, perhaps more?
Well, if you think about it, the answer to that is I think the Russians can. I'm not very confident that the Western countries are willing to do this. It's a major drag on the economies. But if you look back, really, this war has been going on since 2014, when Russian forces invaded portions of the Donbass, and also in the Crimea, right? So this war it's been, but that was a slow, low intensity war. A war at this level, look, the U.S. and NATO and Western countries can afford to support the Ukrainians indefinitely if they wish to do so. The question is will they be willing to do so? And the Russians also, they still have some aces up their sleeves with the energy weapon, which surprisingly to me, they really haven't played to the full extent. They're still selling energy to Western countries, and that's a real.
That's one of the parts of this that I think has been so eye-opening for a lot of people, because early on we were told we're going to crush them economically. We're not even have to worry that much about how the Ukrainians do on the battlefield, because the Russians, once they feel their sanctions and the oligarchs' mistresses can't buy their Chanel purses anymore, and all this stuff, it's all going to come to a halt. Not even close to being true, right? We go back a year to what the policy community, what Biden, the White House was saying, and where we are now. It's almost like there were no sanctions. You have no sense of this being. Have we been more hurt economically than the Russians?
I think the West has been hurt more economically. Energy prices in Europe are phenomenally high, and here in the U.S. significantly high. Look, this has an effect downstream in the economy, and I don't think the Russians have experienced that pain. They haven't experienced the economic pain that we have here in the West. And I think the Russians can actually make that pain worse. That's the real interesting thing about this war, Buck, is the Russians, if they really wanted to hurt the West, they could shut off the flow of their petroleum flows, right? The gas and natural gas, oil, and all of that. But they haven't. They continue to sell to the West while they're fighting Ukraine, while the West is arming the Ukrainians. It's bizarre. And the West is, you have Western countries, Western leaders saying, we will do everything we can to stop Putin, except stop buying their natural resources. I don't know how long that can last. I guess that could last indefinitely. But, you get into some 1984 Orwellian endless war type situation with this. I don't know how long what the tolerance of the West is. But look, I go back to Afghanistan. I go back to Iraq. We couldn't tolerate low intensity wars. Granted, they were being fought by our troops that were, significantly less than what we're witnessing in Ukraine. So is it 2 years? Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? If the Russians are willing to stick it out, I believe time.
But in this case, it's if they take all of Ukraine, then Poland is next, or some other country's next. But Article 5 would seem to me to indicate, given first of all, the problems Russia has even had just with Ukraine, that there won't be any NATO country that's next in this regard. What do you make of all that? What do you think it's a serious consideration that if we don't stop them in Ukraine, we're going to have to stop them in Berlin?
Yeah, I don't think that's a reasonable way to think of this war. I said earlier, I think within the first month, one of the things that this war showed us was that the Russians are not a direct conventional military threat to NATO, perhaps to the Baltic countries. But again, we have Article 5. I think the Russians can see now that the U.S. and NATO will unite and defend its territory. But Ukraine is not a NATO member. And the Russians, look, they couldn't push past Kiev, and they're nowhere near it today. They're on the southern and eastern and a little bit in the northeastern portions. They control probably around 15% of Ukraine. But, that was when they threw probably their best punch. And so if they're, I don't think we need to be sitting around here worrying about the Russians in Berlin and in Warsaw. I do find it ironic that many of the same people who, discounted the domino theory with Vietnam, now make their own domino theory.
Right. It's their own version, right? The slope gets very slippery when they want it to be.
Exactly. This is, it's selective analysis. And, I think you have to look at this. You have to look at what's happened here and recognize that the Russians are not a threat. That's not the argument. The argument is Ukraine is an independent country. It's an ally. It's a friend, and we're going to help them. We're going to help them ward off the aggression of the Putin. And I think that's a reasonable argument and an argument I could support.
Right. So help me with this. If we're giving everybody listening to this a full spectrum argument about all this, which is obviously the goal, when it comes to Russia, let's say, controlling half of Ukraine, if let's say they got to Kyiv or Kiev, and roughly speaking, they were in control of a solid half of the country, and then the Russians said, all right, you know what, fine, we'll stop here. We'll take this part. We've got the Russian-speaking areas of eastern Ukraine. We've got the industrial heartland. We'll stop here. What's the worst case scenario if that were to happen from our interest, from America's interest?
From America's interest, it's that the Russians would have gotten away with aggression. The United States, since the end of the Cold War, look, it's the reason why we went to war against Saddam Hussein, right? He invaded Kuwait, so the United States intervened. We want to set a precedent that one country doesn't invade another and take it over. So that would be a downside. I mean, I don't see that as a direct threat to NATO. It's a threat to the Ukrainians. It's probably a threat to other countries that are not within NATO. If you're countries like Georgia and or any other former Soviet republic, Kazakhstan, for instance, those countries would be very concerned that the Russians are trying to put together the Soviet Union. But again, the Russians have shown us that they aren't militarily capable of invading NATO. I mean, I would say the Russian military is probably won't have that capability for 10 to 15 years, given on what it's expended, what it'd have to put back together, and how it'd have to train an entirely new military and learn to fight a different way. And I don't view that would not be the worst case scenario for the United States in the sense that it would leave a direct threat to NATO. You would have a rump Ukrainian government if there, and I would expect the West to arm that significantly in order to be able to defend itself.
Are there any energy considerations or the change in pipeline or production of natural gas, of oil, that a Russian seizure of most or all of Ukraine would bring to bear? Would it make things markedly worse in terms of the pressure the Kremlin could bring to bear on Germany, Poland, etc.?
No, I don't think it would be significant. There's numerous pipelines that are running through Ukraine, and some of these are still operational while this war is ongoing. So the Russians have shown that they're willing to sell us oil to fund their war machine, and we're willing to pay for it. So the only consideration there is if the Ukrainians cut those supply lines in order to punish the Russians, right? But I couldn't foresee this happening because the West still wants to buy that.
Whatever happened to that pipeline that just mysteriously exploded under the water, Bill?
It's a mystery. I don't know. I don't know why the Russians would blow up their own. I know there's tons of conspiracy theories out there on this. I don't know what the answer is, but I can't see the Russians, who paid a lot of money to lay these pipelines, decide to blow it up when they're more than willing to sell us oil and natural gas to flow through these
people who are saying
pipes.
It's a false flag to excuse Russian aggression. The Russians had already invaded. I don't think they need any. I don't think Putin needs to play that game. I think he just goes after who he wants to go after. So that never really made very much sense to me at all as an explanation.
I haven't seen any evidence that was actually detonated. It's possible that this was an accident, that there was some type of a natural event that caused this. I don't know, but I do know that it makes no sense for the Russians to have blown up their own pipeline, that they're making a lot of money off of.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, Putin, just like everybody, the Russian government, they like money.
They like their money, and they need that money to fund their war
of course. Well, so this is really transitioning into the next thing I want to ask you, which is, how could we make it painful enough for Russia that they do decide to stop? Maybe they are at least willing to make some kind of concessions. Let's say what would it take to get the Russians to sit down and say, you know what, we'll go back to the de facto, call it, pre 2022, but let's say back to basically where things were starting around 2014 with the invasion of Donbass by the paramilitaries and all that. We'll kind of go back to that line. What would it take for them to do that? Is it just casualties? Because it feels like, economically speaking, we don't have the pressure to bring to bear on them.
Yeah, and the Russians have shown, right? If countries won't buy that oil or that gas, they'll sell it to other markets because, look, oil, gas, it's like cash, it's money, it's fungible, right? There's always someone that's out there willing to buy. So I think what it would take would be a significant military defeat. The Russians would have to lose just significant amount of forces, but materiel, like they'd have to lose a large part of their tanks and their air force would have to be severely armed. And I don't think you could do a lot of this without striking inside of Russia. And this is one of those ones where, remember, you asked the question about what might cause an exchange of nuclear weapons.
Right.
That's another one. If the Ukrainians did, using weapons that we supplied, decided to strike deep into Russia in order to hurt the Russians, supply depots, air bases, places where troops are mustering, they would have to hit them really hard, Buck, in order to, significant casualties and significant loss of material. That would force the Russians to, it would create a situation where if they didn't withdraw, it would possibly collapse.
Yeah.
But keep in mind, the Ukrainian position is that's not good enough. Losing Crimea isn't good enough. Losing those eastern areas of the Donbass isn't good enough. They want the Russians out fully now, and that's going to be a hard sell. I don't think it would take, like you said, it would take a significant military defeat in order for the Russians to go there.
We're already sending over Abrams tanks. The Germans are sending over Leopard tanks, is that right? So they're sending over
correct, yeah. And
some of their stuff too. This is pretty frontline weaponry for Western powers. I assume we're providing all kinds of training, intelligence, and logistic support that isn't even really talked about, but that's just the nature of how these things work, how these conflicts play out. So that's all underway. Is there anything that we could give them that we wouldn't have to operate ourselves that would be a battlefield game changer, or is it just no one thing? We get into the Charlie Wilson's war, Mike Vickers assessment, right? That it's not one weapon system for the Mujahideen against the Soviets. It's you just got to give them the smorgasbord. You got to give them everything, right? Is there anything that we could give them that would really make much of a difference, or is it just keep giving them everything we've been giving them?
I think we have to continue giving them what we've been giving them. And it would be, so for instance, the tanks that we're supplying, the U.S. is basically supplying a company of tanks. I believe it's around 12 or 13 tanks. That's fine for a small area, but it's not going to make a strategic difference in the war. It's a minor tactical difference. And I believe all the tanks put together that the Brits are also supplying Challenger tanks, it'll fill out about a regiment, an armored regiment. That's good, but that isn't. I don't think that's enough to drive the Russians.
I mean, the Russians have thousands of tanks, right? I mean, we're looking
exactly. So we would have to give them things in quantities that we can't possibly give them, and that's the real problem. Keep in mind, and a lot of these are just plain old artillery shells. The U.S. has pillaged stockpiles. There was an article in the New York Times about this, I believe, a week or so ago, where they pillaged hundreds of thousands of rounds from a stockpile in Israel and another in South Korea. These are stockpiled in case of conflicts in these regions. Obviously, the one in South Korea, in case there is a war either with North Korea or a war with China. So we're trying to rob Peter. We are robbing Peter to pay Paul here, and we're not giving Peter anything back. So our munitions, we haven't put our munitions factories on a wartime footing. So again, I mentioned this earlier. We're providing the Ukrainians with shells from our stockpiles, with missiles, with tanks and such from our stockpiles. What we're manufacturing now isn't going to replace what we've given them, and at some point, we're going to run out if we don't increase the way we're producing these weapons. So we'd have to give them a lot more than what we're giving them, as well as have the capability to restock. And this is why countries like Germany and other countries are concerned about providing the Ukrainians with their tanks, and particularly the Germans, right? About a year ago, right, I believe it was right before or after the war started, there was an article out where I believe the German defense minister basically, or it was a German army chief of staff, basically said the German army was broken, that, it can't put units in the field, its maintenance was poor on its tanks and armored fighting vehicles. So the last thing the country like Germany wants to do is give up its things that are working to Ukraine when they can't even manage what they have now. And the U.S. isn't in that situation, but we might be there in 6 months. It might take a year. So what we, a lot of this is, again, we'd have to increase the amount that we're giving them. We have to increase the quantity that we're making to fill our own stocks and give even more to the Ukrainians. So, and also I do think that, if we did this, and I'm not advocating this, I'm just saying this is something being discussed, modernizing the Ukrainian Air Force and their air defense systems.
I swear we didn't plan this. I was going to say, are we going to talk about a no-fly zone again this year? Is that what's going to happen? Or at least the provision of advanced fighters and other aircraft, fixed wing, rotary, all that stuff?
But that's not a quick solution, Buck, right? It takes months, if not years, to train pilots and maintenance crews and whatnot in order to make these get them in the air, right? Or to integrate complicated missile defense systems. Right now, we're providing a hodgepodge. I think the Ukrainians need to have a standardization of their weapon systems as well, because again, they're getting United tanks from the United Kingdom, or tanks from Germany, tanks from the United States. These aren't compatible. They might fire the same shells, but they have very different needs, very different maintenance needs and logistical needs to keep these things up and running. And at some point that wears on the Ukrainians. And that's a big cost for us in order to try to keep those things running. I mean, what's the real value of 13 American M1 Abrams tanks in a particular sector of a particular theater in this war? And I'm sure it'd be significant, but in the overall picture, 13 American tanks aren't going to make a big difference.
So I can say this from having been in Afghanistan in 2010 and seeing the country level assessments at the highest level that were being given to the 4-star in theater that the president was reading. I mean, I was seeing all that, and an honest reading of it was there were a lot of people who were trying very hard on the U.S. side to stabilize Afghanistan and make it a place that could fight for itself. It wasn't going to happen. It just wasn't going to happen. There was no plan beyond we're going to just keep trying. And then we spent another 10 years, blood and treasure, keep trying. But there was no plan. There was no path to victory. There was no plan beyond that. It feels like, yeah, we're not in this war taking casualties, which obviously is very important. And I think that's why a lot of people don't even really think very much about what's going on in Ukraine. But we are spending $100 billion a year, and it is volatile, and they do have a lot of nukes over in Russia, and there are concerns here. Is the plan to just kind of keep going and see what happens? Because it doesn't feel like from the U.S. side there is a plan.